Pepsi has put in $2 million. Kraft Foods, Kellogg's, the Grocery Manufacturers Association are all pouring massive amounts of money because they don't, you know, you would think they'd be proud of GMOs, wouldn't they? If they had them in their products, they would be like, yeah, these are great, don't you love them? But, you know, obviously they want to hide it because they know. One of the biggest promoters in the natural products industry is, if you've ever used Dr. Bronner's soap, is Bronner's has poured millions of dollars into the you know, labeled GMOs. It's a really admirable thing. So it's there. So as we go on GMOs, it's the same old problem and the same pattern over and over again. So what's happening now, of course, Mother Nature has outsmarted GMOs. And now there's a huge problem with plants. The weeds have outsmarted Roundup. They know, and now there are many, many species of weeds that are outgrowing it. The bugs, the cutworms and roundworms have, the corn borer worms have figured out the Bt gene in the corn, and they're showing up. And so what's the answer of the big ag companies is, let's develop more toxic products to create this there. So more chemicals. So we all know the goals of big ag is to get as much profit out of the farming system as possible with little regard for the health of the population or the environment or sustainability. Protect the lucrative profit model, sell the seed for premium, which is usually $150 more per bag to the farmer, and then you sell lots of herbicides to go with it. So they get money, double your sales, double your profits. Right now, how big is Dow Chemical? Because, you know, it's going to be the March Against Dow Chemical next year as well as Monsanto. They're $57 billion a year company. Monsanto's $15 billion. How do they buy out the government? Well, they spend $30 million a year on lobbyists in Washington. So I was just equating to how many $100 a plate dinners that would be for taking people out to dinner. And it comes out to 300,000 $100 dinners of wining and dining, you know, people at the FDA, the USDA, the congressmen, everyone there. So, and of course, what's happened is the USDA and FDA went through in September and they approved the new Dow's new product and list, despite the objections of hundreds of thousands of Americans and more than 50 members of Congress. The FDA on food safety and testing is the FDA has no mandate on testing GMOs. They just accept the research that the companies like Monsanto send to them as proof. They don't require independent testing. The GMO foods do not meet the GRAS criteria, which is generally recognized as safe foods, which is the standard by which they rate foods across, you know, in the food spectrum. GMO foods are exempt from that. So only when they're forced to does the information come out. And Dr. Cerlini, who is a French researcher, is the only person who's published long-term studies on the effects of GMOs on rats. And 3 months after his original study came out, it was pulled because of all the pressure from the big corporate. Monsanto and everyone forced his head guy to pull the study. Well, they went back and reevaluated it in June of this year and came back and said the study was stellar, everything about it was solid as anything, and they republished it, which was great news on that. The International Survey of Herbicide-Resistant Weeds website lists 28 glyphosate-resistant weeds around the world, and those are the ones that are resistant to Roundup. So when I say glyphosate, I'm meaning Roundup, is what it is. As a result, by 2012, nearly half of U.S. farmers surveyed said they had resistant weeds on their farms, and the problem is set to get rapidly worse. The reported acreage infested by glyphosate-resistant weeds has risen from 32 million acres in 2010 to 40 million acres in 2011 and 61 million acres in 2012. And we're 2 years past that, so who knows how many that is. Dow Chemical, of course, just got full approval for its new GMO called Enlist. Sounds just like a military operation to me. And it's a combination GMO, which has the Bt gene, which is the pesticide-producing gene that's produced by the corn plant, glyphosate, Roundup, and then 2,4-D, which is half of that ingredient was part of Agent Orange, and we know what that did to our Vietnam veterans, and dicamba. So this equals a new fully stacked GMO that can now tolerate 3 chemical sprays instead of 1 and have a built-in pesticide to boot. How much 2,4-D estimated to be sprayed with the new GMOs is going to be 176 million pounds, 5 to 14 times more 2,4-D that's being used currently. And it's starting this spring of 2015. 2,4-D is already the 7th largest source of dioxins in the environment. So you can imagine, adding that much more, how many more dioxins are going to be there. And aerial spraying causes an herbicidal drift. Scientists have documented that the drift from this herbicide is 75 to 400 times higher for 4,2-D, and it kills broadleaf plants, so it doesn't distinguish plants at all. So if you've got a wind that picks up and they're spraying on the farm and it goes over other farms, it starts killing lots of plants, which include tomatoes, potatoes, grapes, cotton, blueberries, and others. In the 1940s, when they started using this, and they started using this herbicide way back in the 1940s, Iowa was a major producer of grapes in the country, and the 2,4-D completely wiped out the grape production in that state. So here they're bringing back the old guys. Health issues with 2,4-D are linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Parkinson's disease, which of course we've seen with Agent Orange, liver disease, lower sperm counts, endocrine disruption with children at particular risk. A little history of what's happened so far with GMOs. How many pounds of Roundup have been sprayed so far? 500 million pounds. Norwegian scientists just published a new study showing high levels of glyphosate, the active weed-killing chemical in Roundup, are turning up in genetically engineered soy at much higher levels than they thought. So of course it's logical. If you spray more of this stuff on weed-resistant plants, where do these herbicides end up? They end up in what we're eating. So we're getting higher and higher amounts of residues in our corn, in canola, in soy that are happening. Glyphosate residues and its breakdown product called AMPA were much higher. 7 out of 10 GM soy samples tested surpassed this extreme level of glyphosated AMPA, indicating a trend towards higher residue levels. So the amounts that they're finding have been averaging around 9 milligrams per kilo of these. And this amount is much greater than is typical for the vitamin content of the grain. The maximum allowable residues that have been increased country by country used to be, before GMOs were allowed, was only 0.2 milligrams per kilo. When GMOs came out, they upped the allowable amount to 20 milligrams per kilo. So a 200-time increase in that level, or a 100-time increase. And the weeds have become more resistant. The compound Roundup is supposed to degrade rapidly due to sunlight, and now it's being measured by the U.S. States Geological Survey to be in the atmosphere and water. It's coming down in the rain, especially in the Midwest, where high amounts of this are doing. What are the health effects of Roundup? The adjuvants, which are things that are like emulsifiers that make it penetrate into the plant better, can be 1,000 times more toxic to human cells than even their isolated active ingredients. So the other ingredients they add to it, they're not even showing that. They're not even showing the research on what they're doing alone. So the International Agency of Research on Cancer, researchers have found the exposure to glyphosate doubled a person's risk for developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Roundup and its active ingredient glyphosate have been linked to the death of human embryonic cells, breast cancer and other cancers, infertility, hormone disruption, birth defects, eye, skin, and respiratory irritation, spontaneous abortions in farm animals. The endocrine disruptive effect of glyphosate and its commercial formulations is their most worrying toxic effect. They exert their effects at even very low doses, and exposure over a long period of time can lead to severe ill health. An in vitro experiment on human cells, glyphosate herbicides prevented the action of androgens, the masculating hormones, at levels up to 800 times lower than the residue allowed in some GM crops used for animal feed in the U.S. It's also affecting our GI tract and our gut. Glyphosate isn't just an herbicide. It's registered as an antimicrobial agent in the U.S. in a separate in vitro study in strains of bacteria found in the gut of poultry. Most of the pathogenic bacteria tested were highly resistant to Roundup, but the most beneficial bacteria were found to be moderately to highly susceptible to it. So it's helping the bad guys grow and killing the good guys. The researchers documented that the antibiotic damage done to beneficial bacteria in the gut by very low concentrations of Roundup, which allowed the overgrowth of the serious pathogens such as Clostridium, botulism, Salmonella, and E. coli. These would otherwise be kept in check by the beneficial bacteria that are wiped out by Roundup residues in feed. It also suppresses the activity of a very important detoxifying enzyme system called P450, which works in the liver for detoxifying chemicals. Now, Cerlini is the only one that they published his research who really did long-term studies. He took the studies out past 90 days. What Monsanto and the guys have all found that if you just do a 90-day study, the bad effects don't really show up. And it's not until you're really looking at the studies over a long period of time where you really see what's really happening. And so what really needs to be done is governments and those independents need to be looking at multi-generational studies when they're doing animal studies with GMOs. They've got to see what the effects are for the entire life of the animal and what's happening to their next generations that are there. So he used Monsanto's NK603 corn on the rats. The study found severe liver and kidney damage, which are, of course, the major detoxifying organs of the body, and hormonal disturbances, and that low levels of Roundup that are below those permitted in drinking water in the European Union found big problems with just those tiny amounts of the Roundup residues. Additional unexpected findings were higher rates of large tumors and mortality in most treatment groups. Also, the male and female rats responded differently. Females were more sensitive to the presence of Roundup in drinking water than males. The most common cause of death were large mammary tumors in females, and in males it was liver and kidney damage. Most tumors occurred after 18 months, not 3 months. In Argentina, where they have really been using high amounts of Roundup and using GMOs in the soy production, there was a quote from a medical doctor from Rosario, Argentina, quote, "We've gone from a pretty healthy population one with a high rate of cancer, birth defects, and illnesses seldom seen before." He took a group and they went house to house to study 65,000 people in Santa Fe province of Argentina's soy-growing region, and he found cancer rates were 2 to 4 times higher than the national average, and in one village that was located in a heavily sprayed zone, 31% of the residents had a family member with cancer. He studied another village nearby where the sprays were not happening and only 3% had cancer. B-cell lymphoma was strongly associated with glyphosate exposure. Brain cancer rates in children doubled in parents who had been exposed to Roundup during the 2 years before a child's birth. The Bt gene, which is the pesticide-producing part that they put in corn, that the corn plant produces its own pesticide. So the Bt in GMOs are expressed in every single cell of the plant. So the plant itself becomes a pesticide, and they actually are registered as pesticides. So the corn growing in the field is a pesticide, which is incredible. The Bt toxin does not break down in the digestive tract. Bt toxin proteins have been found circulating in the blood of pregnant women and in the blood supply to their fetuses. There is also a 40% structural difference between natural Bt as found in the soil and GM plants. So disturbances also were found in the digestive system, male reproductive organ damage, blood chemistry disturbances, and immune system disturbances. Now they're very effective also at choking off any independent reviews. So because of patents, the companies that produce GMO seeds completely control that. So if an independent researcher wants to use the seed to research the plant, what they have written is you have to send your entire study to us like Monsanto, we'll hold the study and we'll decide what we want to do with it. We are in full control of the results of your studies. So basically they've been able to block any independent person because it's like they can't use their seed. They've got teams of lawyers, they look at what's going on, and they've got full control of independent research. In 2013, 300 international scientists signed a joint statement saying that there is no scientific consensus on GMO safety and that some of the existing studies give serious cause for concern. Now another issue is what's called stacked trait GMO crops. And so they're not even studying these where they're putting multiple ones like in list that's coming out now. Stacked trait means that several GM traits are combined in one seed. So there's one called GMM Smart Stacks corn that has 8 GM traits, 6 for insect resistance, 2 for tolerance to different herbicides. And this can increase the possibility of unexpected interactions between different GM genes introduced into the crop and between the multiple introduced genes and the genes of the host plant. With this new complexity, stacked GM crops are even less rigorously tested for possible human effects than single GM crops. Europe has introduced since 2013 a 90-day toxicological testing for rats on single trait GM crops, but it's not stacked it for traits. They're not even testing it for multi-stacked genes. So the nutritional differences are very interesting. So they are very different nutritionally. So GM soy, for example, has 12 to 14% less natural isoflavones, 27% higher levels of a major allergen, a trypsin inhibitor. In the mineral content, one of the things that glyphosate does is it blocks minerals to a plant. GMO corn had only 14 parts per million calcium. Non-GMO corn had 6,130 parts per million. Magnesium, GMO corn had 2 parts per million magnesium, and non-GMO had 113 parts per million. So there's a huge amount. What glyphosate comes in and blocks the uptake of minerals. So we've got this dead food that has no mineral content to it. So those eating it are getting, much less there. It is claimed that genetically modified DNA proteins in animal feed are broken down in the animal's digestive tracts and are not detectable in the final food product. However, GM DNA present in animal feed has been detected in the milk and meat that people eat. The argument that milk, meat, and eggs and dairy from GM-fed animals do not need to carry the GM label cannot be scientifically justified. Monarch butterflies are in sharp decline, the lowest ever measured, 59% lower than the year before, and it's blamed to Roundup for killing the milkweed. And the argument, of course, goes on as we can save the world with GMOs. So one of the most interesting things that's happened on that is actually in the research of looking at genes, scientists that are working with totally natural hybrids, following the course of nature, have been able to do marker, that's called an MAS, it's a marker-assisted selection. They've been able to take traits and breed them naturally with other plants to create plants that are far superior than anything a GMO would ever think of. And these follow completely normal, natural, biological evolution without the problems. And out of that breeding, number one is the conventional breeding is 50 times less expensive than developing a GMO. And they found that these natural hybrids do everything that a GMO has claimed that they could possibly do. They become tolerant to extreme weather conditions such as drought and flooding, have resistance to the pests and diseases that often accompany them. It's a very complex thing when a plant makes it with the natural genes, and the technology still is so primitive with the GMO that all they really can do is put in a pesticide-resistant gene, or add, a pesticide-producing gene, and I think they have no way they can do these complex things and create this complexity that plants naturally do. So the natural hybrids, they've been developed for Africa so far, have done things like they've got maize that will yield well in drought conditions, cassava that yields well in drought conditions and resists disease. Climate-adapted high-yield sorghum varieties have been developed for farmers in Mali, Africa. Beans resistant to heat, drought, and disease. Pearl millet, sorghum, chickpeas, pigeon peas, and groundnut varieties that tolerate drought and high temperatures. rice varieties that tolerate drought, flood, disease, and salty soils. Drought-resistant rice that yields up to 30% higher than local varieties in Uganda. Flood-tolerant rice for Asia. Tomato varieties developed that tolerate extreme heat and resist disease. And those are just a few that are available from natural hybridization. The evidence that GMOs have emerged since their introduction since 1996 paints a very different picture. Scientific research and real-world farming experiences show that GM crops have not delivered on the promises above. They have not increased yields or sustainability or reduced toxic chemical inputs. They have presented farmers with new challenges in controlling herbicide-resistant superweeds, Bt toxin-resistant superpest. GM crops are no less dependent on artificial fertilizers than any other chemically grown crop. They are not as safe to eat as conventionally bred crop varieties, and they provide no solution to the major challenges of our time: climate change, the energy crisis, and world hunger. GM is based on an outdated understanding of genetics and is destined to fail. It is beyond the ability of GM to deliver anything but the simplest properties, such as herbicide resistance. GM is simply not up to the task of delivering safe, productive, and resilient food systems. Go organic.